Okay, good afternoon. My name is Adela Pineda. I am the director of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies. And it is my pleasure to have you here today. In 2024, both Mexico and the United States will be the site of presidential elections. Mexico in July and the United States in November. In this context, Ambassador Martha Bárcena Coqui presents a talk titled The 2024 Elections and the Future of U.S.-Mexico Relations. Ambassador Bárcena joined the Mexican Foreign Service in 1979 and became an ambassador in 2005. Most recently, she served as ambassador of Mexico to the United States, the first woman to hold this post. During his tenure, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement was ratified and entered into force. She also dealt with a vast array of issues of one of the most complex bilateral relationships in the world. Ambassador Bárcena has authored multiple articles about the reconceptualization of security, U.S.-Mexico cooperation, peacekeeping operations, globalization, the role of non-governmental organizations, international relations, intercultural communications, and diplomacy. She served as permanent representative in the Food and Agriculture Organization, International Fund for Agricultural Development, World Food Program, and the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law. She served also as ambassador of Mexico to Turkey, concurrent with Georgia and the republics of Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, the Kingdom of Denmark, concurrent with Norway and Iceland. Ambassador Bárcena graduated with honors from the Universidad Iberoamericana, where she received a BA and an MA in both communications and philosophy. She also has a BA in philosophy from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and an MA in international relations from Diplomatic School of Spain. This talk is possible because of the Marianne Faulkner Endowment. This endowment was generously, is a Lila's endowment who is thanks to the generosity of Dr. Larry Faulkner and his wife, Mary Ann Faulkner. Dr. Faulkner, former president of the University of Texas, has been a long-time benefactor of this institute, and I need to thank him publicly to make this possible. One of the roles and the missions of this endowment is to heighten the importance of U.S.-Mexico relations by bringing public officials, diplomats, and start a discussion that is beneficial of both countries. So thank you very much, Dr. Larry. Thank you very much, Marianne. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
A pleasure. Well, I will start just telling you a personal story and why the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. is so important, not only on economic matters, not only on political relations, on social relations, but since many centuries ago, and now even more, for family relations, because we are more and more intertwined every day. And I was telling Adela just that today I was at the Texas History Museum. And at the end, I went to the museum shop, and I bought a book about the history of Texas. And for the first time, I found in a book, not only in internet papers, a reference to my great-great-grandfather, whose name was Leonard Pierce from Maine, and who was Abraham Lincoln consul in Matamoros during the Civil War. And he left his family in New York, then returned to pick up his family after the Civil War, And still, I haven't been able to find why he ended in Laredo, Texas. He married also a lady from Maine, Sarah Cushman, from the Cushman family that arrived in Mayflower. And why do I tell you this? Because sometimes in Washington, I was asked, how do you feel being a brown woman and acting this? And I will answer, say, I never categorize myself like that. And I can tell many of you in the audience that I can be more American than any of you, because my family arrived with the Mayflower, even though they migrated then to Mexico. And of course, the daughter of Leonard Pierce and Sarah Cushman was Rachel Pierce Cushman. She married a Frenchman, which I don't know either why he arrived to Laredo, but he arrived to Laredo after working in a ranch called Fleur de Lis in South Dakota. And they had my grandmother, Claire Jeanette Pierce, who was taken to Mexico at 4 years old in the middle of the revolution with no papers. And she lived all her life undocumented in Mexico. So you see, we have undocumented people on both sides of the border. So this is just to show how interesting and complex the history and the relationship between Mexico and the US can be. But now, what I am thinking or proposing, and as hypothesis of this presentation, is that we are really in a very peculiar moment and challenging moment because of the elections in 2024. Presidential elections of Mexico and the US coincide every 12 years. And because since the signing of NAFTA, we had been watching a slowly convergence of public policies and institutions, also like creating in Mexico mirror institutions to the ones of the US to make the communication and the interaction easier. And what we are seeing now, it's a very polarized societies in both countries, in Mexico and in the US, and a trend toward divergent, to be more divergence of objectives, values, and which is not yet felt in the economic relationship because they are very strong, their economic relationships. But the question is if the divergence on political, social, and values will be able not to affect the economic relationship. I think at the end, and that's my hypothesis, it will become to affect them and that will not benefit neither Mexico, neither the US. So just to try to explain how, or to see how these process is taking place, I would like to start for showing you what is now the objectives of President López Obrador when he won election in 2018. Of course, this is a synthesis, but it's first, for him, the word bienestar is key, welfare state. Yes, so the motto is primero los pobres, first the poor, because of the inequality in Mexico, which is a challenge that we cannot deny. So Mexico, it's a very important economy in the world. It used to be the 12th economy. Now we are around the 15th economy. But it's one of the most unequal countries in the world. Only Brazil surpasses us in inequality. So in a way, the López Obrador priority of attending first the poor to combat inequality is a very valid premise, because we had a lot of differences inside the country that we need to solve, to be able to really progress and to be in a level playing field with our partners in North America, the US and Canada. So President López Obrador, he didn't say this in the campaign, but he said it in his first speech as president, that he was going to fight against neoliberalism, basically against the so-called Washington consensus that we know now that the Washington consensus, even in the US, is not taken for granted or as the solution for Latin American progress. Then he won the election, and one of the priorities of his government has been to fight against corruption, because undoubtedly one of the main problems of Mexico and Latin American countries has been the high level of corruption. Then he said also very precisely that NAFTA had benefited Mexican economy, but did not benefit the whole country in the same way. The central part of Mexico, the Bajío, and the northern part were much more benefited by NAFTA, particularly with the integration of the automotive sector, electronic sector. But the south and southeast were basically forgotten. So if we see statistics from NAFTA on, we'll see that the country grew not as much as expected, but grew basically from the central and northern parts. But the south and southeast not only didn't grow, but some states even had a negative growth in those years. Is this something attributable to NAFTA? I don't think so. I think it was basically attributable that the Mexican government from '94 on didn't take the internal policies to integrate the production chains inside Mexico, to integrate the small and medium enterprises, and to integrate the south and southeast. But then for President López Obrador, the south and southeast development has been a priority. And that explains, for example, the big discussion that maybe you saw in the press 3 weeks ago about where to establish Tesla. The Tesla factory that Elon Musk had said in Nuevo León, because it's, of course, closer to Austin, and President López Obrador wanted it to be established in the south and southeast of Mexico because of the availability of water. But for Tesla, water was not the priority, but of course infrastructure and access to a well-trained workforce. Then President López Obrador said no tax reform was going to take place during his tenure, it hasn't taken place and it will not take place. But these will present in the future, as I will say, a big challenge to be able to support all the social programs that he has implemented during his tenure. No increase of debt, no debt increase, which has been kept more or less. He has been loyal to this promise up to a point, because the higher interest rates now in the US and in Mexico, basically, the CETES interest rate is at 11.25% a year. So that means the interest rates of all the Mexican bonds and the Mexican debt had gone up. And only yesterday, he announced that the Mexican government is buying the Iberdrola plants, the Spanish product, for $6 billion. The Minister of Treasury gave a very convoluted explanation of why this will not impact the CFE and Mexico's debt, but it will impact, because it will be the development banks who will have to go to the markets to raise that money to pay Iberdrola, $6 billion. But it is very important that for President López Obrador, austerity has been a key word. And what he has done is to redistribute the budget. So he has eliminated many autonomous organs, many trust funds that were used, for example, to pay for scientists going abroad to do some research. And he has really focused the budget on social programs that I will describe in the next diapositive, and on certain specific projects. And he has said, my priority is domestic policy. That means he has not given much attention to foreign policy. And as a matter of fact, when I was named his ambassador to the US, he gave me 2 instructions. First, you have to work with Congress and get USMCA ratification process. you have to get USMCA ratified. And that this was really his priority, and we reached it. And second, keep the front with the Trump administration calm so that the relationship with the US does not become a problem for my first 2 years of government. And I can concentrate on my priorities. And we almost managed, except for the time in which we had to negotiate migration and tariffs, which was a nightmare, I can tell you. And it was a very difficult moment, because for the first time in many years, we didn't compartmentalize the relationship on different areas, but we mixed two areas that were explosive by themselves: migration and trade. So, what have been the main programs and objectives of President López Obrador in this reorientation of the budget that I mentioned? First, the universal pension for the elderly. Yes, los adultos mayores. That is now the program that is taking more resources. And it has been criticized by some, but generally speaking, in Mexico, it is considered the most successful program of López Obrador. Why? Because many people call it, and rightly, the dignity pension, la pensión de la dignidad, because it has given all elderly people that do not have any other access to resources some dignity. Just for you to know, 55% of the Mexican workforce is in the informal market. That means they do not have access to Social Security, not to pensions. So this pension really gives something to the people that doesn't have anything. So this is considered quite good. Then the second big social program is Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, Youth Building the Future, which is paying a training scholarships for the young. And then the third big social program is Sembrando Vida, Sowing Life. That means it's a reforestation program, particularly in the south and the southeast, on fruit trees and what it's called trees that can produce precious woods, because in the south and southeast of Mexico, we have always had precious woods. You just can go into reading the history of Campeche, which was the most important port to export the precious woods from the Lacandonian jungle and Central America. But there are now a myriad of social programs, both at the federal level and the state level, which made it very difficult to have a follow-up on the amount of money that is being spent in all the programs, and even more difficult to evaluate to see if they have been successful or not, because also there are not clear benchmarkings to evaluate if these programs are successful or not. Then he did a change to health programs. We had a universal health program called Seguro Popular, which was implemented by Julio Frank. Now he's the rector of the University of Miami. This disappeared and was substituted by INSABI, el Instituto de Salud y Bienestar. What happened in reality is many millions of Mexicans remain without access to health, to universal health. Then he said, I want Mexico to be self-sufficient in hydrocarbons, mainly gasoline, because we are still one of the big producers of oil in Mexico, basically heavy oil, but we import most of the gasolines that we consume, because most of the gasolines are processed in Texas refineries, because the Texas refineries are really prepared to process the heavy crude of Mexico. And that's why he bought, among other things, the Deer Park refinery in Texas from Shell, but only part of the refinery, only the part of the gasolines, not of the plastics. And that he decided to build a refinery in Tabasco, Dos Bocas, which has been criticized particularly by some because they think since we are in the transition to a new era of energy transition and a new era of green economy, people ask if the Dos Bocas investment will be recuperated, if it will if the Mexican government will not lose money at the end with the Dos Bocas refinery, not considering some other environmental damage that has been done there. And basically, as I said yesterday, he announced that he was buying for $6 billion 13 plants of Iberdrola. So it is basically a going backwards on the energy reform that was approved during Peña Nieto's government. And his aim is to regain control of the market for the state companies, Pemex and CFE. So, which, by the way, are state companies that are heavily indebted. And that even Pemex, I think it's almost the only international oil company that owes $130 billion. Even though last year it had earnings or gains, but no really at the level of other international oil companies or national oil companies. Just for an example, he said that with the buying of the Iberdrola plants, now CFE will have the control of the production of electricity of 55% of the market, and that his aim is to finish his term next year with a control by CFE of 65% of the market. And of course, this gives what it corresponds to his mentality of having a very statist point of view of sovereignty equals energy self-sufficiency, sovereignty equals food self-sufficiency, which is something to be discussed, but that is his approach to what the interpretation of sovereignty. And what it's true is that even this buying of CFE of the 13 plants of Iberdrola, it doesn't add 1 kilowatt of electricity. It doesn't add. It just switches the production from the private sector to the public sector, but it doesn't add more production. So if we see some comparative data, and we are still waiting for the final data of 2022, in 2018, when President started, the total GDP of Mexico was almost 300 trillion in U.S. terminology. Yes, in 2021, the GDP was below of what we had in 2018. It was lower, it was smaller. And of course, it had to be with the decrease of growth that we had in 2020 because of COVID. But the economy has not really recuperated to the level of pre-pandemic. Mexico is not the only country that is in that situation, it's true. But that means that GDP per capita, instead of increasing, has diminished. And that the social programs that have been implemented, they have been good to be like palliatives for the very poor. Because without those social programs, the situation of the very poor people in Mexico could have been worse. But those social programs have not been able to pull people out of poverty, just to compensate the very big impact of COVID-19 into the poorest people of Mexico. Now, for 2022 GDP growth, it was almost 3%. So at the end, now we might be balancing in 2022 or 2023, having the same GDP as 2018. And for the GDP estimate for 2023, there is a big discussion. Most of the analysts say that it will be like 1.4 or 1.7, but the government says that we will grow in 2023 3%. We will see. So there is a lot of difference on the analysis from the government and the banks and the specialists on how Mexico will grow. So at the end of President López Obrador's tenure, Mexico's total GDP and per capita GDP may be lower than in 2018. So that means that we will be approaching the presidential elections and the relationship with the U.S. not in a better economic situation, but at least the same that we had in the best scenarios, the same that we had in 2018. And social programs, as I said, have been a palliative for poverty, but have not really reduced poverty in Mexico. Fiscal prudence, internal and external debt, had not grown significantly, except for this rise in interest rates, very recent ones. So that has helped a lot to keep Mexico's credit ratings in a good level so that they have not been really affected. And the peso has been and is one of the strongest emerging markets currencies for many reasons. For this fiscal prudence of the government of Mexico, which is true, but also because a lot of money that was going to Russia from the Western world is not going anymore because of the sanctions. So they had to look for other markets, and one of the most obvious markets for that money going to emerging markets was Mexico. So foreign direct investment is increasing in Mexico, it's true, because of nearshoring. And nearshoring it will be one of the key areas and words for the relationship between Mexico and the US in the near future, but has grown below opportunities and expectations. In a scale of 0 to 100, let's say that we are receiving FDI in 40. Instead of receiving it at 70 or 80, because of the lack of juridical certainty, differences on USMCA implementation, which I will refer later on, basically on energy, on agricultural biotechnology, on rules of origin of automotive, and some areas regarding on the environmental chapter of USMCA. And lack of access to reliable, sustainable, reasonably priced energy coming from renewables. I don't have to explain to you how important it is to public companies listed in the US, increasingly the so famous ESG, and how the very active, sometimes minority shareholders really want to have these companies getting more and more energy from renewables. And this is something that Mexico cannot guarantee in this very moment. So how much will impact this foreign direct investment in Mexico is something that we will see in the upcoming years. And most of the infrastructure projects that I also mentioned, which is Refinerías Dos Bocas, which is Tren Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Transísmico, basically, and the Aeropuerto Felipe Ángeles, which has been concluded as an alternative airport to Mexico City. But it is considered that most of the infrastructure projects like Tren Maya and Transísmico will not be concluded by 2024. So one of the questions is, what is it going to be done by the next government of Mexico on these infrastructure projects that are not concluded? And we do not know how well and how much will the refinery of Dos Bocas will be producing. But according to some specialists, we will not be able to be self-sufficient in gasolines by 2024. And which is also true is Mexico has lost ground and influence in the international arena. President López Obrador has not attended not even one of the meetings of the G20 group. He has sent only representatives, and even if Mexico is considered a very important country from the economic point of view, but also of the issues that are being discussed at the G20, so we have not been able to sign and ratify the updated agreement with the European Union. There has no been a visit of the high-level representatives of China, Japan, or India to Mexico, or vice versa. So we were, of course, non-permanent members of the UN Security Council for the last 2 years, also because this was negotiated long before. So, basically, it's we are not really attending the most important conferences at the highest level. That means at the presidential level, which makes a difference in international relations. All of you know that. So what is the main risk of Mexico in post-2024? The possibility of a post-electoral conflict, which we haven't had in the last 3 elections. The transition of power has been very peaceful, but now there are some fears that there might be a post-electoral conflict. I think that what happened in the last 3 days with elections of the new councillors of the Electoral Institute, I think the post-electoral conflict will diminish. But it is not something that we can take for granted, because now the reforms to the electoral law in Mexico were suspended by one of the judges of the Supreme Court, but there is a very complex legal procedure, and we don't know if these reforms will finally be in place for 2024. If they are in place for 2024, which is not certain, we will have, for example, a change of rules of how the Mexicans abroad can vote. And the new mechanism to allow the Mexicans abroad to vote will be without the credential of INE, but only with a passport. That means, imagine that you have 5 million Mexicans in Los Angeles. Imagine that you may have 2 million with passport, and that maybe 1 million decide to vote. The queues in Los Angeles at the consulate, and the possible manipulation of who votes. So it can be a really tricky issue, and that's why people are afraid of a possible post-electoral conflict, which I think there is a possibility, but I see personally it like remote until now. We'll see how the legal challenges in the Supreme Court work out in the following weeks. Then, as I said, with the reorientation of the budget, many autonomous institutions have been left without budget or had disappeared, basically. Like INAI is not working, the Institute for the Access to Information. And we saw that the lack of budget to, for example, the National Institute of Migration, how it finished last week in the terrible fire in Ciudad Juárez. It's the first time that 40 migrants died under the protection of the Mexican government. They were under the protection of the Mexican government, which is something that makes a huge difference. Then possible sanctions in the context of USMCA, and increasingly in the context of the war against fentanyl. So I personally think that before the end of the Biden administration and the López Obrador's government, the Biden administration will not impose sanctions on Mexico, even if under USMCA. And why? Because they had not established a panel yet on the energy divergences, and neither a panel on the agricultural biotechnology. So I think that the Biden administration is not willing to impose sanctions, not to politicize the sanction and influence the elections of 2024. But the pressure from US Congress and US private sector is growing. So the question here is, how much can the Biden administration resist that pressure? To call for the panel, and then if the panel is contrary to Mexico, to impose sanctions that are provided in USMCA. And second, you have been following also the different initiatives to use force against the organized crime in Mexico and to declare the Mexican cartels, basically Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and the Sinaloa cartel, as foreign terrorist organizations. And what does this implement? The answer up till now of the Department of State and of some moderate Republicans is do not call the cartels foreign terrorist organizations is not needed. Neither the use of force. Use the instruments that you have, the tools. And the tools are basically the Kingpin Act and another decree of Biden to identify, the leaders of drug trafficking, and then you can impose sanctions on those people. So just for you to know, if these sanctions are imposed, just imagine that in the Kingpin Act, the US government decides or knows or says the governor of X state of Mexico, it's protecting the cartels. So I will impose sanctions on a governor of a state. Imagine it's like Mexico would say, I will impose sanctions on the governor of Texas. It will be a huge problem. So this is a scenario that we cannot discard, that may happen from now to 2024, depending on how the conversations on USMCA on one side and on fentanyl cooperation on the other side. There are two big possibilities of imposing sanctions to Mexico in the context of USMCA and in the context of the fight against organized crime. Then we have that the two governments will arrive to 2024, and in 2025 we'll start the technical discussions on the so-called USMCA sunset clause. That because by 2026, the three countries that belong to USMCA may say if they want to opt out of the agreement or not. I personally don't think that Mexico will ever opt out of USMCA, but if things get more and more complicated, then the discussions on the sunset clause can become very politicized. And it will not be like a very terse, let's say, transition. And then what is being discussed in the U.S., it's how big is the territorial control of organized crime in Mexico. The U.S. normally identifies the U.S. government, 4 states, Sinaloa, Michoacán, Guerrero, and Sinaloa, Michoacán, Guerrero, and Tamaulipas. Yes, Guerrero and Tamaulipas. So, and then the debt payments, because the interest rates have gone up so high that now the debt service of Mexico is going up to, even if we have not contracted more debt, the interest rates are up. And then what will be the financial support for Pemex and CFE? Because both companies are basically broken and they're in red numbers. So what will be the margin of maneuver of the next government of Mexico regarding Pemex and CFE? What are the main opportunities? Because there are many. Of course, USMCA, which is the anchor for the relationship with the US, and the nearshoring. Because Mexico should be benefiting more than any other country in the world of this competence between the US and China. And I can tell you that I lived it while I was the Mexican ambassador to the US when we had COVID-19. When we had COVID-19, the US immediately came out with a list of essential sectors that needed to continue to be operating, even in a pandemic. And it was a very detailed list of essential sectors with subsectors. Canada had a very short list, and Mexico had none. We simply don't have or didn't have any essential sectors list for a pandemic. And neither in NAFTA, neither in USMCA was any provision to have a mechanism to get together and define or try to agree on the essential sector list. So we had to work, the two embassies, the US Embassy in Mexico, the Mexican Embassy in the US, with the Minister of Economy of Mexico, and this Ambassador Lighthizer didn't want to know anything about it, and with the companies to keep the essential sectors open. So, for example, one day I received a telephone call from Raytheon, said, Ambassador, we need your help. And say, what's happening? We cannot produce the Black Hawks. If you close a factory in Ciudad Juárez that produces, I don't know, it was something very small. So, and they are closing it. I mean, for us, it's imperative that you keep that factory open. We didn't know that that factory was a supplier of Raytheon and the producers of Black Hawk. So I talked to the president and said, we need to keep this factory open because for the U.S. Defense sector is essential. They cannot close their defense sector. And so we started working with Boeing, with General Motors, with Ford. Boeing had 56 suppliers from Tier 1 to Tier 5 in 26 states of Mexico. So how to keep open that supply chain? We asked Boeing that they had to implement in Mexico the same safety measures, sanitary measures that they were implementing in the US, and they had to guarantee that those safety measures would be implemented up to Tier 5. And we were with the same method with General Motors, with Ford, and one day we had a closure, but the other all the rest of the time, the supply chains kept open in Mexico. And so the US saw that Mexico was a very reliable partner and saw that China was not. And so they realized, okay, we have to switch some of the production back to the US or to North America. So one of the main reasons of this nearshoring is not only the competence, it's because we saw in COVID that the North American region could not depend so much from Asia, and particularly from China, in areas as, of course, automotive, defense, pharmaceuticals, electronics. So other countries really want Mexico back as a reliable partner. I think the US knows that we are a reliable partner. I think Spain is a little bit doubtful with all the Iberdrola's issues. I think a great opportunity, really opportunity, will be a migration reform in the US in the next government. Why? Because the US needs the workforce. You have more than, I don't know, now more than 5 million jobs that are not fulfilled. And we have the workforce in Mexico and in the rest of Latin America. What we don't have is the legal pathways to have that workforce. So as long as this this workforce is kept undocumented, they are more vulnerable, and the migration issue becomes more political, because all the political debate is polarizing and really politicizing the issue of migration as a national security and identity issue, which is also, in the US is not being considered as what it is, the social and economic phenomena that we need to regulate. And the more we take only coercive measures against migration, the more we will have tragedies like the one in Ciudad Juárez or this. So we need to change that mentality. And what amazed us, a lot of Mexican specialists, is that for years it was the Republican Party who was in favor of migration reform for the workforce. And now they are totally politicized against it. And it's with no relationship with the real economic needs. And then the possibility of seeing for the elections of 2024 a new experiment in Mexico, which could be a coalition government. That means the opposition parties against Morena, but based on a coalition government proposals and programs. And we'll see. It's not easy, and the possibilities of that happening are getting lower and lower, but it is not impossible. And also many measures that have been implemented by decree, that means executive order, can be easily reversed, but not the changes in laws and basically not the changes in the Constitution, because that needs 2/3 of Congress to approve. So there are opportunities for that. So what we will see, I have kind of described more in depth the priorities of López Obrador's government. I will go very, very fast through the priorities of President Biden administration, because you know them better than me. But something, it's of course COVID-19, but also the priorities of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, bipartisan law, and the CHIPS Act. And those three different legislation, it's really what is telling us is that the US is entering a new era of industrial policy with the transition to green energy. You may agree or not, but that seems to be going. Then for us, very important for Mexico is the ban on assault weapons that President Biden is giving impulse to. The police reform that has not progressed a lot. The migration and asylum broken system. Since the beginning of his administration, he introduced a draft legislation through Senator Bob Menendez that has not progressed at all in Congress. U.S. institutions, he has tried to really give back the strength to the U.S. institutions. I think the Biden administration has also as a priority the fight against white supremacism, and there is a big discussion that it's also very important for Mexico after what happened, for example, in the killings of El Paso. So that it was really this white supremacism. Also, the Biden administration and the U.S. in general has the same problem as Mexico, as a polarization. But even if Mexico is the most complex and relationship and the most important in certain ways for everyday living of the Americans, of the U.S., it's true that from the foreign policy point of view, for the Biden administration, there are three priorities, or two that basically ends in one. One is the Russia invasion of Ukraine, because it really changed all the security panorama in Europe, and it really has shaken the basis of the order established after the Second World War. And second, the so-called confrontation/cooperation with China. That is also it's a bipartisan approach. So there are differences in how to cooperate or confront, but the two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, and I can tell you from my experience in Washington, they agree that they have this confrontation/cooperation with China. I had a very long conversation about this, I remember, with a former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, who was the lead on one of the papers on this duality of confrontation cooperation with China. And at the end, both things, Russia, China, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the confrontation cooperation with China goes into the debate of autocracies vis-a-vis democracies. So, and this is something that will mark also the future of U.S.-Mexico relation. Is Mexico considered an autocratic country, or is Mexico considered a democracy? Because I think the U.S. doesn't have doubts about Canada, but they are starting to have doubts about Mexico, at least in certain circles, and that is very worrisome for the future. So, what has happened between 2020 and 2024, especially after the election of Joe Biden, of President Joe Biden? Joe Biden administration was concentrated on the reinstitutionalization of the relationship with Mexico. Because with President Trump, he really cared only about two issues during the first 2 years of President López Obrador, USMCA and migration. He didn't, his administration didn't care much about other issues. Yes, sometimes there was some discussion basically on border issues, border security. You know, we have a continuing dialogue and measures going on how to build new ports of entry, how to improve them, because now, you know, the main port of entry of the U.S., and the U.S. classifies the ports of entry the same way, either they are ports at sea or land ports. Now the number one port is Laredo, above Los Angeles and Long Beach. So most of the trade of the U.S. with the world is done through Laredo, not anymore through Los Angeles. So that is why we're working all the time on border issues. We dealt with some issues of water, the Water Treaty of 1944, the Rio Bravo and the Rio Colorado. But basically, there were not these dialogues that used to exist before the Trump administration, because he really didn't believe in institutions and on these wide dialogues. So with the Biden administration, a new security arrangement came into force to substitute Merida Initiative, which is called the Bicentennial Framework, and a new high-level security dialogue took place, and a new high-level economic dialogue took place, and they were reinstated then the North American Leaders Summit that for 5 years didn't take place. So again, meeting Biden, Trudeau, and López Obrador. And this is something that in general is good because it allows for constant work and not only to approach two issues, but really cover most of the complexity of the bilateral relationship and the relationship in North America. What are the main challenges now? I would say that the first is trust. After the detention of General Cienfuegos in Los Angeles and then the liberation to be trialed in Mexico, and there was no trial, basically we lost the trust on the dialogue on security matters. And this has impinged the fight against organized crime. So we have to regain trust. That it's easier to say than to do. We have in international relations the term confidence-building measures. Believe me, just to implement confidence-building measures is very difficult. Then second is migration. Why? Because one is the asylum issue that has to do with the nationalities that are really now crowding the border, which is Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and Haiti. Just for you to know, before coming here, I was looking at CBP numbers. In fiscal year 2023, that started in October 2022, until February 2023, the U.S. returned to Mexico 894,000 people. It is amazing. It's simply the cities at the Mexican border cannot hold those people. It is impossible. We cannot hold, we don't have the installations, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources to deal with those people. And of those 840,000 people that were returned on the Title 42 and Title 8 to Mexico, almost 300,000 were returned at the border between El Paso and Ciudad Juárez. So what we saw in Ciudad Juárez was a tragedy waiting to happen. It was a tragedy because the migratory policies of both countries are wrong, because they cannot go on just detaining and deporting people, because that doesn't solve the issue. And second is the part of the labor and the need of workforce that I also referred to before. The U.S. needs workforce. Mexico has some of this workforce, and Latin America, there are no legal pathways to match these two different approaches. Then the illicit drug trafficking, fentanyl, I am afraid that it will get worse, because once the numbers of dead people in the U.S., dead people from fentanyl come out in April, my sources in Washington tells me that they will be higher than last year. And last year were 100,000 dead people from overdose, of about 70% of them from fentanyl overdose. And if they are higher, the pressure from Congress will be unbearable, both on the U.S. government and in the Mexican government. Then from the point of view of Mexico, the illicit arms trafficking, which is really one of the reasons of the violence in Mexico. Because it's so easy to buy, assault weapons, AR-15 in the U.S. And of course, we have a great responsibility of our customs that we are not stopping them. But now we have a problem that you can buy the arms in pieces and you can assemble them back in Mexico. So it is becoming a terrible problem, and then continues the USMCA implementation basically on the two areas that I have said, which is energy and agricultural biotechnology. So what are the main now what we'll see on post-2024? The campaigns. I think we risk that in Mexico, the anti-American sentiments will grow, and these have almost disappeared after NAFTA. But they have been really fueled by this government, and now even more. And a risk of nationalism, particularly if we don't find a methodology to cooperate on all the issues that I've been listing, like migration, fentanyl, and this. So, and also Mexico being the piñata in the US campaign, as it was in 2016. And we managed not to be Mexico as a main issue of the campaign in 2020. And I can tell you, we work very hard. Because I had also instructions and a long conversation with President López Obrador. I said, for me, it's very important that Mexico does not become an issue of the campaign in 2020, and that you are not put in the same bag as Erdogan, Putin, Bolsonaro, and this. And we manage. I don't know if we will be able to manage in 2024. But we work hard with Congress, with media, with think tanks in 2020 to avoid that. So that is what worries me in the campaign, that we will not have a rational discussion on the relationship, but it will be highly politicized on these issues. And the pending issues, it's, as I said, USMCA, energy, agricultural, biotechnology, sunset clause. As I said, it will start a technical review by USTR and the Ministry of Economy in 2025. So imagine the new presidents, whoever they are, just Mexico taking office the 1st of October, the US taking office in the 1st of February, I think, or January, and then immediately starting the discussions, technical discussions on USMCA. Then the migration depends on Congress, organized crime, security, drug trafficking, fentanyls, armed trafficking, and illicit traffic of people, because we need to fight illicit traffic of people. Because why most of the Venezuelans arrive to Juarez? Because there are illicit traffic routes and people that are able to take them to different parts. And then at the end, for me, the two most important things, the challenges to democracy in both countries, because we were terrified in Mexico when we saw the assault on Capitol on the 6th of January. And if the US has been the beacon of democracy and the paradigm of democracy, and this happens in the US, then who is going to take the torch of democracy? And second, also because there is a trend in Mexico and in Latin America of saying that more important than elections in democracy is a so-called democracia participativa, by referenda, and what we are seeing, it's a split in Latin America, even of two different conceptions of what is the left in Latin America. On one side, you have like Boric in Chile, and on the other side, it's basically Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and you have Mexico, Colombia, this going like, should we go this way? Should we go this way? And Lula, that we don't know. So this is something that it's real. And it will play in the elections, and it will play in the future. And just imagine if Mexico tends to go towards Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela more, then the relationship with the US will be much more complicated. And the rationality for a USMCA will not exist. So this is something that it's really very, very important and goes at the end to trust the basic quality. We have to recuperate the trust among political elites, among the private sector of Mexico and the US, and something that is more important. We need to regain a more intense relationship and trust between the societies, the young people, the Mexican community in the US. The Mexican community in the US is not well understood in Mexico. And it's not well understood in the US either. People do not realize how powerful this Mexican-American community, which is not one, it's many, depending on the areas, on the regions, how strong it is, and how important for the economy of both countries is, and how it can change the face of both countries, and not only with remittances, but with education, with the US becoming the second largest speaking country in the world, largest Spanish-speaking country in the world after Mexico, before Spain and Argentina and everything, because we have that immense richness of the Mexican-American community in the US. And you can measure it in different ways. 38 million of first, second, and third generation are between 11 and 12 million of first generation, about 5 million of undocumented, among them almost 1 million dreamers. And none of the two countries have been able to really say our future relies with that Mexican-American community. And we have to work with them. And so the priorities for me in US-Mexico relation post-2024. The trade is already around 700 billion US dollars a year. Just to imagine, it's larger than the Argentina's GDP. The trade between Mexico and the US, larger than Argentina's GDP. Mexico is the first or the second trade partner of the US. It has been for the last 2 years, either first or second, first or second, first or second. Nearshoring, border infrastructure. With USMCA and with nearshoring, our border infrastructure cannot deal with the trade that we have. We have to implement it fast. And in this area, Texas is key, because it has Laredo port and because it has most of the ports and most of the trade. Our first trading partner in the US is Texas by far. It was like 240 billion US dollars, followed by California, 90 billion. And the third, Michigan, because of the automotive industry. And so if the Texas government, private sector, this doesn't put all the efforts on border infrastructure and all the pressure with this, the border infrastructure will collapse, will not be able to hold the increase of trade that we need in the future. Then we need to find a way to cooperate on the fight against fentanyl. We don't even have a common diagnosis. The US said most of fentanyl is produced in Mexico. Mexico said it's not true, it is produced in China. We only make the pills in Mexico. So we need to have a common diagnosis to be able to have a cooperation process and arms. And migration is the current situation is untenable. The Mexican community in the US, we really need to work with it. Cultural and educational cooperation that has almost disappeared of the map of cooperation. There are more Korean students in the US than Mexican students, which is crazy. And very few American students are going to Mexico. And environment and energy transition, it's really just the trips of John Kerry, yes, COP15, COP16, but not there. And I will say, I will always end my talks as ambassador saying, we are a marriage that cannot divorce. So if you bring me coffee in the morning, I promise to cook for you quesadillas at night. So, and I said this, and I was very happy that recently there was a US delegation seeing President López Obrador, and Senator John Cornyn, I used to visit him quite often, used the same phrase. We are a marriage that cannot divorce. He didn't use quesadillas metaphor, but it is true. So we need to rebuild a common vision for the future. We don't have that common vision of the future. With Mexico's emphasis on sovereignty, with different no diagnosis together on fentanyl, on migration, and this. So we need to make our ways to converge again, not to diverge. And this is something that we have. So I will say thank you. We have a common future. We have to work on it. And I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
No,
this was amazing, at least for me. And so I just want to know if the audience have questions or comments. We have some minutes to do this, to have a dialogue with the audience. So anyone? Oh, okay, you and then.
Thank you. And thank you, Ambassador. Extraordinary presentation.
Oh, thank you.
You've touched on very difficult issues without, any polarization, without any exaggeration. I think it's clear, compelling, important.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I have a question about 2024, July 2024, and the elections in Mexico. You said that the opposition is working on a coalition government. If the elections were today, according to most surveys, Morena would win.
Yeah.
The question would be with Sheinbaum or with whom? Which would be, will that be a continuity of the present policies, or maybe there will be a divergence? Now, so on the one hand, you have the problem of if Morena wins, and depending on who's the candidate, where will the country go? And relations between the U.S. and Mexico. And that would be like a major miracle by the Virgin of Guadalupe, I think. But if the coalition can happen, if the opposition can unite, which is very doubtful, but if it can, and form a coalition government, what do you think the chances are? And if they win, where would the relationship go?
Well, I will try to address the first issue. I think you're right. If the elections would take place now, Morena will win, without any doubt. And I think there are basically three pre-candidates: Claudia Sheinbaum, Marcelo Ebrard, and Adán Augusto. So according to polls, Sheinbaum is ahead of most of the polls. So most probably the governor of Mexico City, most probably, but not 100% sure at all, she could be the candidate of Morena. Also because President López Obrador wants to be inscribed in the books of history for all reasons, and it will be historical to have the first woman president. So this is something that you have to take into account. I do not know personally well Claudia Sheinbaum. I have seen her a couple of times, talked to her a couple of times. But she's a scientist, so maybe her scientist mind will prevail on some issues, but we are not certain. I personally believe there are some social programs of President López Obrador that have to be kept in place, like the elderly pension. Others should have to be reevaluated and maybe reaccommodated. And of course, if you have invested $17 billion in Dos Bocas, you better finish it. You don't get it to ruin. You better finish it, no? And this is something that some business people in Mexico tell me, say, we think it's a disaster, but there has been so much money invested in it that we better help to have it finished and have it worked. So at least not to lose all the money. That is what some Mexican businessmen think, that they are working already. So I think she will follow more or less this emphasis on fighting inequality and fighting corruption, which is something that there is a big discussion in Mexico if the fight against corruption has been as successful as everybody expected, but this is another discussion. And so if we were going to do maybe in Mexico the polls now, maybe the candidate will be Claudia Sheinbaum, and maybe she will win the election. But we'll see until next year. Second, What helps Morena a lot to win the election is the disaster of the opposition. I mean, the opposition, I shouldn't be saying this, but I am not the ambassador anymore, I was. But the opposition leaders are a disaster. The worst in this current moment. So don't quote me, but many Mexicans think like that. And of course, I personally think that Morena will not win by a landslide. And why? Because to win the election, you need the votes of at least 3 of the 6 following states. Estado de México, which has 11 million voters. Ciudad de México, Nuevo León, Jalisco, Veracruz, and Puebla. Even if you win the whole South and Southeast, win 80%, you don't win the presidential election because they don't have enough voters. Mm-hmm. We'll see what is the result of the state of Mexico now in July. If the PRI managed to keep the state of Mexico, which is not probable, then the situation for Morena will be very difficult. And because also in Mexico City, the middle class is very angry with the government. And President López Obrador won the last election in 2018 with a vote of the middle class and with the vote of the northern part of Mexico and the central part of Mexico. These states are not going to vote Morena. Nuevo León is not going to vote Morena. Jalisco, maybe. Puebla, difficult. San Luis Potosí, Querétaro, that voted López Obrador, they will not vote Morena. They are very angry. They are middle-class states, and they have been the beneficiaries of NAFTA and USMCA. And they are not happy with Morena. So it will be very difficult for Morena to win the same amount of votes that they won in 2018 in the central and northern part of Mexico. And the southern and southeast part of Mexico, they do not have enough votes to win as big as López Obrador won. So even if Morena wins, will be with a less percentage. So anyone who is the president, even with Morena, will have to negotiate. Much more than what López Obrador had needed to negotiate with Congress now. So the situation is complex, and my personal view is that anything can happen in July 2024, huh? Anything can happen. I wouldn't be surprised if the election is much more closely tied than what everybody is expecting. And that is why I mentioned the possibility of the post-electoral conflict. Mm-hmm. But I think now, yes, Morena will win, but we'll see what happens in the state of Mexico, and then we'll see what happens until July 2024.
Here? I don't know why she wants me here, but I'm here. Thank you very much for your talk. And I wanted to talk about the post-electoral conflict because yes, you brought the example of the Mexican votes abroad. Mm-hmm. In 2018, there were 98,000 votes.
Yes, there were very few.
I know there are very few because Mexicans abroad, they are not interested in voting for Mexican elections. I don't know how you can jump up to 1 million votes, even if they have passports, which they have. But I don't see the chances for post-electoral conflict because, first, Morena controls now most of the country, 22 governorships. Mm-hmm. In the state of Mexico, the candidate, Delfina, she is almost 20 points above the PRI.
Depending on the polls.
Well, yeah, all the polls in Mexico, all the polls in Mexico are cuchareadas, and they manipulate the polls. Mm-hmm. And there is an average of 8% manipulation of electoral polls, but she's above.
Yes.
Probably El PRI will keep Coahuila, probably. So Morena controls all the country. And it doesn't matter if it wins by 5% or 10%. It's a victory.
Yes.
So now, all the predictions now are that Morena will win in 2024.
Yes.
It all depends on Congress and the Senate. And maybe the difference will be lower or higher. We don't know. But what is the conflict? There are institutions, even if Córdoba is out of the INE, thankfully, no? Because the INE doesn't supposed to play politics as they play it. Even what happened in the INE, with no conflict, the new councillors are in with no conflict, because we are seeing a fictional polarization in Mexican politics. We see a long-lasting campaign from 2006 held by the Mexican oligarchy that started with the enemy of Mexico and continues until today. It's a very long campaign. They have spent a lot of money. One oligarch said that he will pay up to 8 billion pesos to overthrow the president. I mean, this is not small talk. So what we see is that this long-lasting campaign, putting empty tents in the Zócalo and trying to produce even long
pay attention to Frena, really.
Well, but this is the polarization.
But
Frena is the polarization.
But they don't have any impact in Mexican politics.
I know. And based on this, many people are talking about polarization because they don't have any real impact. Even with all these campaigns, they keep losing elections. So where is the conflict? 2024 will be no conflict in the election. Now, regardless of who wins.
It's, as I said in my presentation, it's one of the scenarios that with the substitution of councillors of INE diminished the possibility because it went better than everybody expected, the elections of the councillors in INE. But even of what you say, and I saw this as ambassador, what you see now is an increasing participation of the Mexican community in the US. I saw it, I talked with the consuls in a very key cities. The Mexican community is being divided by political parties, and they are fighting each other, which is something that is not good for the Mexican community. Because instead of fighting for the rights in the US, they are fighting, particularly the old guard of the Mexican community, on party lines. And I saw it. And we know that. All the consuls, and when we saw it, that. And if the community it's divided, and you can manipulate them to go to vote for certain candidates with a passport, not with a credential, then I am not saying that it will happen. I'm saying that it could happen. And I hope it will not, because it will not help anyone. And I agree with you. Most of the Mexican community, they do not want to vote, and they do not want to have impact in Mexican politics. What they want, especially the younger people, is to have a very strong Mexico, to be able to have more presence in the US, to have more presence in Congress, to be, and I will tell you a story. One of the congressmen of Mexican origin from Arizona once told me in a party, you know what is my dream, Ambassador? Congressman Gallego, who was so key on the 6th of January, said, no, Ruben, tell me. My dream is that Mexico will become part of NATO. And I was like, what? Said, why do you think that? Said, because the Mexican army will be the second largest of NATO after the US, above Turkey. And we Mexicans need a strong Mexico to be more important in the US. I can discuss with you if it is a right approach or not. I discuss it with Ruben for hours. But that showed me that the ideal of a lot of Mexican Americans in the US, it's very different of what we think in Mexico is their ideal. They don't want to see a Mexico that leaves people in jails burning in Ciudad Juárez. And this is something that we have to understand. And this is why I say that the Mexican community, and particularly the young generation of Mexican Americans in the US, is not well understood in Mexico. And that's why they are more interested in being stronger in the US than in participating in Mexican politics. So I basically agree with you in many points. And I think Morena will win the elections now. We'll see what happened to July 2024. We'll see what will go. I think the INE went quite well. And I think the INE is one of the greatest institutions of Mexico. If the US had an INE, the 6th of January wouldn't have happened. So we should fight for our institutions. And of course, we have to adjust them. Their budgets are very high in INE. Of course, that we have to adjust the budget. We have to have a more austere elections. With that, we all agree. It's the way and the timing that you do things. And that the institutions in Mexico are proven to be quite reliable now. The Supreme Court is taking the decisions they have to. Either you agree with them or not. And at the end, people will adapt to what the Supreme Court and Congress say. As easy as that. And we have to respect the results of the elections, whatever they are. And if Morena wins, happy that Morena wins. And if the opposition wins, happy that the opposition wins. They have to work with a vision of a stronger Mexico, of a more just and equal Mexico.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you very much for the clarity of your presentation. I'm really shocked by what you just mentioned about the partidization of Mexicans here in the US. I never suspected that. And I would like to go back to what you just said at the beginning of your talk regarding to what extent political polarization is affecting particularly the policy elites. And those policy elites, I'm not talking only about Washington, D.C., but also subnational policy elites. What would be your view? To what extent this polarization is also affecting the way local or subnational policy elites see Mexico and the possibility of a more profound collaboration between the two countries?
Well, that's a very difficult question. But I can see some polarization, maybe not in general, but on issues. I think the most clear case is even Texas on migration and Florida on migration. Mm-hmm. And also Texas on fentanyl and drug trade. If we go through the positions of Governor Abbott, they are clearly aligned with the most conservative branch of the Republican Party. And for example, that measure that the governors of Florida and Texas took to send the migrants to very cold places with no preparation, I mean, I would call that a polarization of subnational entities. Yes, and of course, both states, Texas and Florida, are key for the relation with Mexico, particularly Texas. So if things continue to be this way, it's not helpful for the relationship. And on the other side, I would say now that we had the fire in Ciudad Juárez, when the video was leaked into the press, the reaction of the government, of the federal government was, oh, the video was leaked by the Chihuahua government. This is also part of the polarization, which is not helpful, because that means that the sub-national entity or government is not working properly with the federal government in both sides, in both countries. So I think it can affect. I think also we see that maybe with mayors. We see that, for example, with the mayor of Ciudad Juárez, who was the one who was asking the National Immigration and the National Guard to take the people to the detention centers because they were begging in the streets and this. And why? Because I told you the numbers. 300,000 returned from El Paso to Ciudad Juárez in 5 months. Of course, there is no city that can hold that many people returned or expelled. So I think that the polarization process, it's taking place in the elites. I also think that, of course, the polarization in Mexico is bigger in the oligarchy, as the gentleman was saying and the private sector was saying, of course, because they are more affected in their interest. But also in subnational entities and in society in general. And this is something that I don't think that it's useful for the relationships. You saw in my CV that I was the Mexican ambassador to Turkey. I was in Turkey when the break of the talks between AKP, Erdogan party, and the Kurds took place, and there were 2 bombings in Ankara, one very near the Mexican residence and the US residence. And I was there when the attempt coup d'etat took place. So I've seen the polarization in many countries. I've seen the polarization in Turkey. I've seen the polarization in Georgia. And it's no good. It's no good for any society, neither for Mexican society, neither for Texan society, neither for US society. Are we aiming to be like the Nordic countries, working always by consensus? It will be in countries like the US and Mexico impossible. We are too diverse. They are very homogeneous countries in which to create consensus is easier. Mexico and the US, we are so diverse countries that but we should aim at least to be civil in our differences. And sometimes we are losing that civility. I'm afraid of that. Mm-hmm. Una más, sí.
Okay. First I want to echo the previous comments. It was an excellent presentation, very clear and illuminating in many, many respects. It stuck to me the issue of trust, right, as a key element. And you mentioned this briefly, and I thought it will have a larger impact, and maybe if had the INE issue. The way I think I remember reading briefly a New York Times article on it, like suspicious activities pretty much happening at the government level in Mexico the weekend, right? The watchdog or elections watchdog in Mexico. So my question is, in what extent do you think this INE, as you said, the moment, the timing, and the way it was done, has affected the trust that the United States has on Mexico?
I think it has affected. I think it has affected the trust in the institutions of Mexico. But I think that what we saw last week on how the issue of the consulars was solved will diminish that lack of trust, will help to rebuild trust with the new INE. And so, yes, I think the debate on INE was affected. I've met as ambassador Lorenzo Córdoba when he went the first year to the U.S. This fight was non-existent. So it was a very easy relationship of Lorenzo Córdoba and the people from INE with all the think tanks and congresses. this last trip of Lorenzo to the US, maybe it was unnecessary. Just created a little bit more polarization that needed. But I think the main challenge in the issue of trust is on cooperation on security. Perdón. I turned it off, but it was video. Sorry, my daughter. So I think the main issue of lack of trust is in the exchange of intelligence information on fighting organized crime, drug trafficking, this. And to be totally honest, is our authorities cannot be very successful in fighting organized crime without US intelligence. And we know that. Having said that, the DEA has exceeded itself many times in Mexico. So they have built their own disaster. They should have been a little bit more prudent and institutional. But you just have to read the history of DEA to know that the US had dismantled the two previous agencies before DEA because of corruption and disaster. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future the DEA is substituted by something else. And so we have to rebuild trust on security. We have to rebuild trust on trade. We have to rebuild trust on juridical certainty. And we have to rebuild trust in that we share common values for the future, which is basically democracy, freedom of expression.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Let's applaud her.
Gracias. Gracias, Adela. I hope it came to the expectations.